Yes. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining tonight. I'm very excited to have all of you here, as well as Francois, who made the way here to Zurich today. And he will talk about the versatility and in particular the utility of attention and transformers as a whole. And the format today is a bit different from what we usually have, because at our PyData meetup, we usually have like a couple of shorter talks. And today we try out a bit of a different format. So feel free to give us feedback on that. Talking about the PyData meetup, I'd like to know who's at the PyData Zurich meetup for the first time today. It's quite a bunch. Welcome. So I guess it amortizes that I briefly say what this is about. So PyData is a global organization that is a non-profit, and it seeks to build a community of users and developers of open source data tools. And open source is really in an extended sense here, because it doesn't only apply to code, but also to knowledge in a way. So Francois sharing his lecture notes, I think, is very much in the spirit of what we mean by open source. And the ambition and the goal of this community is to share ideas among like-minded people and to build a platform for us to connect. So to get ideas from what other people are doing, but also to just maybe meet your future employer. This organization is, as I said, global, yet we have local chapters. And these local chapters organize different kinds of meetings. So we have meetings such as today, which are basically just meetups where for an hour or two we meet and listen to a talk, but there's also conferences. And some of these conferences do happen in Europe as well. And upcoming are PyData Berlin and PyData London. I think PyData Berlin is either sold out or about to be sold out, so hurry if you're still up for 3 days of Python and data science. And I think PyData London tickets are still available. Maybe your employer is up for paying for that, so give it a shot. We are not Google, but we're very grateful for Google to host us. If you work at a company where you think that would also be interested in hosting us at some point, please feel free to reach out. We're always looking for hosts. With that, I don't want to make you wait any longer. And we want to get closer to the talk. So as I said, Francois will give the talk. And if you don't know Francois, he's been involved in many interesting research institutions in France and in Switzerland. Currently, he's a professor at University of Geneva, was and is still affiliated with EPFL. And you might know him from his lectures that are open source or publicly available, that made waves in the internet on Hacker News and whatnot, as well as his little book of deep learning, which I can strongly recommend. A book that is optimized to be read or caters at least to reading on a phone, and covers a lot of ground and the essentials when it comes to deep learning, which got a lot of critical praise from all of the world. So and it's freely accessible. So give it a shot, or maybe buy a printout. And with that, I would like to give the stage to Francois. Give him a warm welcome, please.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the invitation and for the nice introduction. So I'm going to talk about transformers, the attention models in general. And I'm convinced by, I've been convinced by attention models and transformers. So maybe as a first question, who knows transformers? Attention, yeah, okay. GPT, who knows Python?
Okay. I think you need to choose the layout again.
It's switched off?
I think what you did before,
yes,
to share a screen, I think.
Sorry for that. It's always embarrassing when you have.
We all have this problem.
It should be. That's strange. My goodness. What can I do? Okay, I can. Sorry for that. Yes. I can switch it off and switch it on again. Wait a second. Do we get something here?
Yes, very well.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk about attention models in general, and mostly applications not in natural language processing. So the GPTs and transformers and other attention models are well known for their performance in for natural language processing. But what I'm going to show today are different applications. We use them for many different things. So if we go back to what was until recently, until the transformers, the main model for deep learning were the convolutional networks. So they have been used in vision, but in other for other applications. And they had a lot of very good properties. So they were extremely powerful approximators. So in computer vision, they really solved a lot of tasks that we were not able to solve without them. They scale extremely well with data and computation. And they were, and maybe that's the important stuff, they are extremely fitting to data structure, to data which have a hierarchical structure. So a scene, computer vision processing, you can generally see it as compositional. So a table is a flat part with legs. A leg is an arrangement of edges. Edges are an arrangement of pixels. So they were very good for this. So here it's a picture of the neocognitron from Fukushima, which is probably the first convolutional model. It was not trained with backprop, but it's awesome. So you can picture abstractly a convolution like that. It's really, you have a signal which has a structure, so in that case, a one-dimension vector, and you basically apply the same affine operations everywhere. And it's great, it works very well, but again, the justification generally is that it makes sense if the signal is stationary. So in computer vision, again, or even in sound processing, if extracting certain type of features or doing a certain processing at some part of the signal makes sense, it usually makes sense to do the same stuff everywhere. If it makes sense to detect edges in an image, simply because you have some kind of stationarity of the distribution, pictures tend to be taken in many different positions, it makes sense to do the same stuff everywhere. So from that perspective, if the signal is stationary, and if you have local structures which are informative, and you have this compositional structure, it makes a lot of sense. But if you go to, so it worked really well. I mean, DeepNet, ResNet and stuff really completely replaced any other alternative in computer vision on signal processing, on speech processing. But when we looked at natural language processing, there was a recurring problem that was also present for computer vision, but not as critical, which is that often you need to pick up. So, for instance, if you want to translate this sentence in English into French, because of the grammar of French, which is slightly complicated, you need to know that Pomme is female, and don't ask me why. And then you have to change the way you write the adjective. So you have to add the E at the end of the adjective. And so in that case, to make the proper decision when you translate this sentence here, you need to choose to write this word to have a look at this one. And so here we have something which is problematic, which is you have to transport information from one part of the signal to far away, which also is something that happened in vision. So the typical example was when you do synthesis of faces. Before the attention models, you sometimes had the problem that you would have a face with a hearing, for instance, totally realistic on one ear, and the hearing totally realistic on the other, but they would be different because the model would have to synchronize this information from far away in the signal. In a ConvNet, you have to propagate through the layers, and the information does not propagate more than the kernel size. So if your kernel is like 5 pixels, your information really can move 2 pixels on the left or 2 pixels on the right, and you really have to stack a bunch so that you get the information from far away at some point. So when you see this problem, or the same in vision, what you truly want would be something like that. You don't want to apply something locally and make a computation, but you would like to dynamically allocate some path of data transportation in some way. You would like to, looking at the data, decide, oh, I have to take information there and there and there and move it there. And so here comes the attention model, which is really the solution to this problem. And there are two things. There is the attention operator, and then there is a multi-head attention layer. And so there have been, before the famous 2017 attention is all you need paper, there was a lot of models of attentions, but really this is the dominant one now. It's the stuff. It's, every time we talk about attention, this is really what we have in mind. So the idea is that you have three tensors which have, so you have a query tensor, a key tensor, and a value tensor, and you are going to combine them in the sense that the query will hit the keys, and depending on how it hits the keys, it will weight the value. So in that case, by the way, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask questions during the talk. Raise your hand, and I will be plenty happy to answer. So here you have a query tensor, key tensor, and value tensor, and what the attention operator does is that for each query, you do a dot product, you compute dot product with each key. So you have a series of queries. So each query has a certain dimension, say 32, 512, whatever. And the keys have the same dimension, but you may have a different number of keys. And for every query, you hit, or you take the dot product with all the keys, so you get a matching score. And then you do a softmax, and you have a distribution for each query over the keys. So it's really, the semantic is really, what are the keys that look like my query? And when you have a strong similarity in the sense of dot product, the weight will be higher. And what you do then is that you take those values as weighting of your value, and you compute the weighted average, and you get the result. So again, this is really the key operation is you have queries, keys, and values. For every query, you compute the similarity with the keys, and then you average the values according to this similarity score. And it's an extremely powerful operations because it depending with what we have there and what we have in those tensors, and I will come back to this, it can really operate in different regimes. It can really be almost a database kind of stuff where if you hit one key very strongly and not the other, you just retrieve. You are going to retrieve one value. But it can also do some smooth averaging. It can actually mimic convolutions. So it can really, depending with the value you put in there, cover a large family of algorithms in some way. And there are other things because softmax, so you do a softmax, so you take the exponential and you normalize. And the exponential also has very good property because when you are near zero, you have a very smooth averaging, but if you start to take very negative values, it disappears. You can really have something almost symbolic. It can really hit a single key. And then we do it again for the next query. And so this is really the attention operator that I'm very happy with my little pictures. So the colors show you the size of the tensors. So you see that you need to have the dimension of the keys have to be the dimension of the queries. The number of the keys has to be the number of values. And really, you take the dot product. So when you do this as a matrix at a tensor operation, it's really you take a query tensor transpose times the value tensor, and you get so-called attention matrix, which is, and then you take the softmax, sorry, and then you get the attention matrix, which says for every query what is the weight on all the what I'm saying. No, sorry. For every query, what is the weight along the values, and then you take again a product with a value, and you obtain the result. So it's very neat because it's expressed in a very compact manner as a tensor operations. So this is so now that we have the attention operator, what are those queries, those keys, and those values? And here you have two versions of it. So generally you get, so maybe I should go directly to there. Either you get a single sequence, which is again a sequence of tensors, and you apply a linear operator for each. So you multiply x by, so you get your tensor of vectors, you multiply by a matrix WQ, and you get your queries. So you really apply a linear transformation on each element of x, and you get one query. And then you apply another linear operation, you get one key, and you apply another one, you get a value tensor. So either it's so-called self-attention, you get one tensor from which you compute the queries, the keys, and the values, in which case you have as many keys, queries, and values, and then you get the result at the end. Or you have so-called cross-attention, where you have one sequence that gives you the queries, and another one that gives you the keys and the values. Okay. It's a lot to swallow if it's the first time you are seeing this, but really after a bit of practice, it's a very natural operation. It's very And what is interesting again, as often in engineering and science in general, and in deep learning in particular, that it took years to reach this thing. But now if you think about it and you're like, yeah, it makes so much sense. I need to compute to be able to have a matching score. So the product is the simplest one. Of course, I have to normalize. So of course, I have the softmax. And then of course, I want to have a feature of vector too. So I have the values. So in the end, it seems very natural when you're used to it. What may happen is that sometimes you may mask the attention matrix. So you may either, if you put zeros outside outside the upper diagonal, if you keep only a thick diagonal, it means that you have a local attention. So you force the query to only look at the keys which are nearby. We do this often, but not much. What is, however, super important is that you may want to have a causal structure. So I won't go into detail for this, but when you do NLP, for instance, or when you want to have an autoregressive process at the end, you can't allow a key to look at the future. It can only look at what has already been produced. I won't go into detail. I'm plenty happy to discuss after if you want. But so you may want to mask the attention matrix so that you cannot use the future to predict the current stuff. So maybe to illustrate with a very concrete example, this is a toy task just to illustrate the power of this attention operator. So here the task is as follows. I'm going to so it's totally synthetic. I'm going to generate a 1D signal which has this form. So I'm going, so this is, let's say, the time on the x-axis. On the y-axis is an amplitude. And I generate every sample as follows. I pick 4 locations for time, for width, for height. And on the 2 first, I put triangles. On the 2 other, I put rectangles. Okay, so I generate stuff like that. And they don't overlap. If they overlap, I just resample to prevent it. Okay, so this is my input signal. It's a 1-dimension signal. And I want my model to predict the output signal, which is generated as follows. I want to take the average. I want to replace the 2 triangles by 2 triangles which have the average height of the original triangles. And I want to replace the 2 rectangles by so same width, same position, but the height is the average of the height of the rectangle. So it's a totally synthetic task, but just to show, because it's exactly what attention is for. You want the triangles to look at the triangles, the rectangles to look at the rectangles, and they may be far away, so convolution will be allied. And indeed, if I so this is a typical. I add a bit of noise because you know it's in statistics we have noise. So I add a bit of Gaussian noise, and then I try first a baseline, which is simply a 1-dimension convolutional neural network, which is simply conv1D, 1 channel, so I have a single amplitude. I go to 64 internal stuff, 64, 64, 64. My channel size, my kernel size is 5, my stride is 1, padding is 2, blah blah blah. So I keep the size of the signal, simple stuff. So what we know already is that I'm a bit mean, because this thing is going to propagate every time you convolve by a kernel of size 5. You can go 2 pixels on the left, or 2 positions on the left, or 2 positions on the right. So if you stack 10 of those guys, 5 of those guys, it will be lost if there is more than 10 positions between stuff it has to combine. And indeed, if I look at the performance, we get this kind of stuff. It behaves very poorly, where so sometimes okay, yeah, I'm very mean because okay, I did not show, but you can see in some it's very cute, because when the rectangles are close enough, it does the job, and when the rectangles or the triangles start to be far away, the poor thing is lost, and there's no way of doing it. So of course, here I'm trying to sell attention models. If you are a hardcore convolutional model person, you would say, nah, I can fix this. I would put more layers. I would put bigger kernels. I would put a general. Oh, yes. So if you give me $1 million to make this work, I will make it work. But we agree, we would like, it's very natural to want to use attention layer here. So yeah, I'm just explaining what I'm saying. So here I build a attention layer from scratch. So it's really directly the equation. So you give the number of channels as input, output, and the dimension of the keys. You create your matrix that goes from X to the queries. So here it's I implement it with convolution, but it's simply because I want to apply a linear transformation at every position. So I implement it as a kernel of size 1. You have the same for keys, for same for values. When you give me an X, I apply my thing at my convolution queue at every position, and I get my tensor with now the keys, the query at every position, the key at every position, value at every position. So I have my three tensors. I compute my attention matrix by doing, so this is Einstein summation to make it clear. You go from sample, channel, position in the sequence, again, sample, channel, position in the sequence, and you get the attention, which is number of sample on position. You apply softmax on the keys, so you normalize. And then you compute the stuff again by taking the product of the attention matrix by the value. So it's really, the slide of the compute was exactly straightforward, this stuff. And now I keep exactly the same model, but I just remove one of the conv layer and I put my little self-attention layer. And I remove a read. And really, I insist, this for me is important. This is code I write myself. So I know what I did, and I know it worked when I tried. It's not one of those things where things have been cherry-picked and tried many times. And really, it works the first try. So it shows this stuff works. And I'm going to repeat this a lot because really it works amazingly well. And so now if we try, it works very well. So you can see the output is the yellow one, and it works. And what is really cool is that when you do the compute, you have the attention matrix, which tell you for every position in the sequence, what are the positions which are attended to compute something there. And here what I do is that I put a little marker, so squares for the rectangles, deltas or triangles for the triangles, and you can see them there. So, and you can see that the squares attend to the squares, and the triangles attend to the triangles. So it really does. So dark means a lot of attention, light means no attention. So it really does what it's supposed to do. And again, in this one, you see. So this stuff really, you know, the narrative and the history match very, very well. It really does what it's supposed to do. And so this stuff is one key component of the famous transformer. So this is the model, the original model from Vasvani et al. In 2017, where you have, so it was for sequence-to-sequence translation. So you have a sequence, you encode your sentence in German or whatever as a sequence where you do have an embedding. So you have one vector per token. Token is a way of decomposing words. Let's say at the word level, for every word you have a vector. And then you go through processing like the one I described, but you have multi-heads, so you do several in parallel and you concatenate stuff. And then you apply MLP at every location. On this, you repeat this n times. So let's say you have 8 blocks like that. And you have recoded your sequence in a way. So a lot of magic happens, but really the key stuff, and it's a bit similar to ConvNet in this respect, is that you are enriching the representation of your words by collecting related information. So, for instance, it could be something like, if you say the furious black cat was hunting the mouse, the word cat, you could probably see that in some of the attention operations start to attend to furious and to black and start to bring this information in the representation of the token of cat itself, so that you can do more reasoning based on this enriched representation. It's really what happens, and it's really what is super hard if you don't use statistical methods for language, is that you really want to pick context and adjectives and what is the action of who is doing the action, what is the object of the action. All those things can be done. So, okay, there are plenty of literature. You have probably heard of it, but what key element is that, as for ConvNet years ago, those stuff really scale beautifully. So you throw data as a GPT. So this is the paper from GPT-2, I think. So a GPT is just something like that. You don't do because in that case you have your sentence in German, you encode it, you have a representation, and then you feed this representation to this other block that does the autoregressive process to produce your sentence in English, say. But a GPT is really just this part like this. It's just an encoder able just to learn the statistic of the next word. And so here it's a graph from a paper from 2020 where you have the compute, the validation loss, which really reflects that your language model works better. It's really a good, perplexity is really a good indicator. and every curve is a model, and the colors give you the number of parameters. But what you have to take from this graph is that we are not plateauing like at all. We can, and it's still the case. The more data you throw at those things, the better they learn. So something that happened then, GPTs are simply autoregressive models. So you train them simply to predict the next token. So let's say the next word. And really, it's if you look at the code of training a GPT, it's really you do cross entropy on the next token. You have 100,000 words in your dictionary, and you just train the model so that given the tokens before, the words before, it predicts properly the distribution over the next words. And it works really well. So if you train something like that, it produces sentences. But what people realize after, with GPT in particular, is that, or maybe some people were already understanding that, but I have the impression everybody was a bit surprised, even if a posteriori it's a bit obvious, is that if you learn correctly the language, if you are able to learn very well a corpus of text, you go far beyond grammar and syntax. Of course, you do grammar properly and syntax properly because you have to follow the rules of the language, but you have also a lot of knowledge, because if you are able to complete the sentence, the capital of Switzerland is, you know geography. If you are able to complete the sentence, when water reaches 100 Celsius, it starts to, and you say boil, you have some physics. So those things learn a lot of stuff. And here, so this is really an experiment. Again, I did myself. So I took a GPT-2 Hugging Face pre-trained GPT-2. So it's a small language model. It's only 100 million parameters. And here, what I did was simply to write the part of the sentence which is not in bold, and let it finish. And the bold word is what it produces. Okay. And so here I write I for input, I colon water boils at 100 degrees, output physics, the square root of 2 irrational, the square root of 2 is irrational, output mathematics, set of prime number is infinite mathematics, gravity is proportional to the mass, and then I stop and I say I ask the model to continue. And so the model now is in a statistical context where there is this alternance input, output, input, output, input. So it will go on. It probably picked up that output is only physics and mathematics. Even with 3 examples, it probably correlates this with something it saw in the past during training, that when you have a text like that, there are probably tons of text of exercise and question answering and stuff. So he picked up this structure very quickly. And it continues, and it's a physics, because it probably also saw in the statistical structure of this little prompt that stuff that looks like physics go with physics, and stuff that look like math go with math. But so it works. So it just, if I write squares are rectangles, which is something that my daughter had a lot of problems with their teachers at school. And it makes me crazy. So they say that squares are not rectangles, whatever. And so in that case, it's mathematics. So this, I think, is, if you have been raised in the idea that machine learning needs tons of examples, you are already like, okay, these things delivers more than expected. But what is, and again, this is really a small model. I did not cherry pick, I insist. So here, I love apples, positive. Music is my passion, positive. My job is boring, negative. Frozen pizzas are awesome, positive. So here, you may not be surprised. Awesome is a good word. Okay, cool. I love apple, but frozen pizzas taste like cardboard, negative. So think about this. This is a droid. He has no idea that you are not supposed. He does not eat pizzas. So where is this coming from? It's very, very interesting. So it has picked up in the statistical structure of what it shows that sometimes we make jokes about stuff. Okay, pessimistic people would say this is probably in the data set. So maybe there is already sentence pizzas, frozen pizza tastes like cardboard. Okay, I suspect not, but whatever. But it's able to pick up, again, in the pure statistical structure and do this kind of few-shot learning, even with a small model like that. And everything we see, like the ChatGPT and the Claude and the Gemini and everything, relies on this, that you train them on massive amount of text, and then you can leverage the pure statistical structure not only to produce text, but to answer your question. So you can get knowledge by prompting them intelligently. So then, the same structure as the transformers, even though it was developed for NLP, was applied to computer vision. So this is a VIT, so it's a pretty it's surprisingly brutal. So you just patch the image in blocks, and you say, this is my tokens, okay, and then and it gives a fantastic result. So yeah, it's a you patch it. You have a linear transformation to make your tokens, to make your X. You go through a transformer, vanilla garden variety transformer, but at the end you have one more. At the beginning you put in the sequence one more token which does not correspond to a patch in the image, and you can do a readout over there. So you can pick what this token, and you train this token to tell you whatever, image classification, image whatever. You have plenty of applications. So it works very well for images. Okay, so now I'm probably 10 times too long. No, how long do I have? It's fine. Okay. So now I'm going to show some little test I did myself, which I find cute, and then I will show stuff done by my students, which are more serious. So the cute stuff. So I'm a bit of a Twitter addict, and at some point there was a discussion on Twitter that some people who don't like deep learning were saying. So there was the DALL-E stuff on whatever, I don't remember which model, and those stuff were able to draw, a green elephant on a skateboard in Central Park. But if you were asking, there is a red apple on the left of a yellow apple, it would do crazy stuff. It would do two apples on a chair, and it would be completely lost. And those people were arguing that, of course, deep learning is hitting a wall. It cannot do this. Of course, it can do this. My guess was that it's simply that those huge data sets, so those stuff are those text-driven image generators are trained with gigantic data sets as everything, and you can't collect data sets where you have geometrical information. Nobody in his right mind is going to comment his holidays photo by saying, "This is the street of New York, comma. There is a green car on the left of a red car, comma, and there are two guys." Nobody does this. So of course the model is completely clueless about geometrical relation. They are very bad. So I don't know if it improves with recent GPT-4, but even the state-of-the-art models, you were asking them, I was playing with this, you stack a red plate on a green plate on a blue plate, you take the red plate, where is the blue plate, and it was completely lost. The poor thing was completely lost. But for me, it was purely data. So what I did was, I create this data set where I have very small images, 12 by 16 pixels, where I put 5 colored pixels at random, between 1 and 5, there is a various number of pixels. And then I generate all the properties of that sort. Either there is this color, so if there is a red pixel, this statement will be correct. Then you have other statements which are more, there is already a bit of geometry that tells you if a pixel is in the top third, bottom third, left third, or right third. And then you have relative positioning. So you could say red, left of green, blue, okay. And so what I did was, I would generate an image for each sample, for each sequence. I would generate an image at random by putting between 1 and 5 pixels at random. Then I would generate all the statements, so I would have often tens or hundreds of them. And then I would sample between 1 and 10 of the statements. And then I would create the sequence by putting the statements and then the image in raster scan order. So what it means, this is this kind of stuff. So you have yellow right of red, correct? There is green, correct? Black below red, correct? Green above yellow, correct? Green left of red, correct? Black left of red, green left. And then the pixels in raster scan order. So one line after another, one row after another, okay? Yeah, it's interesting because you are more computer scientists. I give this talk to math people and they are like, yeah, what? So what? The information is there. So they don't see that it's complicated. And then what I create the sequence like that. And of course, what I do now for testing, I prompt until this token and I let the GPT, and it's really, and again, I wrote this GPT myself, so there is no trick. I know exactly how it works, and it's really low tech. It's ReLU. I use layer norm and fancy people now. I am lost with the non-linearities, it's GLU or whatever. So it's really absolutely, there is no, I don't know how to say it, but there is no magic trick. It's really, I took my GPT, which is very crude, train it on that, and it worked immediately. So what you get, so those are training examples, this kind of stuff. Okay, and this is the model. So the dimension of the model, so between attention blocks is 512, the keys are 64, the MLP has 2000 dimensions. I have 8 heads, 12 blocks, dropout, whatever. If you're familiar with GPTs, you know this. Training is done with 50 epochs, batch size 25, Adam, I'm not a fancy person, learning rate. Yeah, if people are a bit sophisticated with scheduling, they must be verified. I just take 10 to the power minus 4, and at some point I move to 10 to the power minus 5. I always use this setup. I have not changed it for months. And this is what you get. So my way of, so the perplexity first, so the perplexity goes down on the train, so it's able to predict more and more. It overfits quite quickly, standard stuff. You see that at some point we change the learning rate at 30, we move it to 4 to 6, we see that it changes. But anyway, but what is interesting is the number of, so how I estimate the performance of those things. I generate 1,000 images, exactly like the training ones. And then I prompt the model with only the properties, generate the image, and I count how many of the properties requested were actually fulfilled. And you see that we are at 99, so this is a percentage missing in the log scale. So we retrieve 99.3% of the properties. So if you look, it works. If you say red above green, green top, blue right of red, I generate 4, it works. There is red, there is yellow, there is blue, so no geometrical constraint to bother it a bit. It works. It sometimes put more pixels, but that's correct. This one is tough. Red below yellow, yellow below green, green below blue. I ask you to generate the picture. You have to sit, to calm down a bit, take a pencil and say, okay, so this is like that and this is like that. It's really like a system of discrete equation. It has to solve it, and it works. Okay, so it really works. And then to see if it was actually understanding anything, what I did was to remove during training all the properties which would involve green and horizontality. So as soon as a property had green in any way, anywhere, on left or right, I would remove it from training. Okay, I would not change the test set, but the train set is there would never be green on horizontality. And here, so the coverage, so now if I look at those properties in test, initially I had 99.07 properties fulfilled. For those ones, I have only 67. So if you never heard about left, right, and green during train, and you ask left, right, and green during test, it's lost. And actually, I suspect you get 67 by pure luck. Or maybe because you have indirect constraints. So yeah, it's not clear in my head, but I suspect it's really done. It's really lost. But what I did then, it was to, so bottom line, it did not abstract the notion of color. It did not understand that you have colors, you have positions, but those things are really, in terms of statistics, are factorized. So all the colors go with all the positions. It's really still so green as a specific stuff. So then what I did was to increase the number of colors from 5 to 25. So everything is the same, but instead of having 5 pixels taken in a list of 5 colors, you can have 25 colors. So now the overall coverage dropped by 2%, but for the green, it goes up to 84. So it starts, because you have more colors, the colors themselves start to be templatized and abstracted in some way. So we see a glimpse of the kind of thing where when it can brute force, it brute force. And when it starts to require a higher level of understanding or modeling where things become variables in some way, it starts to do it. Okay, so now more serious stuff. So I've been applying with my student transformers for everything, basically. So this is the first project. This was with a student who is at TDAP and a company called SkySoft. They do the air traffic control software in Switzerland. And the project was quite nice because Switzerland is difficult weather prediction-wise because there are mountains. It's small. It's very difficult actually. There are turbulences, a lot of wind. You have the hot mountain and cold mountain on one face and the other, so it's very complicated. On the wind speed, the measurements are very sparse. So they are a few hours or stuff. It's like 4 times a day. It's really. But what is cool is that so first the traffic controller, by looking at the planes on the radar on their trajectory, are able to infer the front of wind. They even though there are no measurements, basically if a plane is flying like that, there is some wind from a direction. And so they use this to the control. They infer. They say, okay, there must be wind that direction, so I'm going to give this command to the plane. On the plane, they measure stuff on the body of the plane. So they broadcast to the base station the wind speed they measured on the plane itself. So what we have, which is cool, we have trajectories in 3D, on 4D, it's spatiotemporal, and we have the speed measurement at every one of those positions. And then it's cool because you have the measurement along trajectories which are coming from the same distribution as the trajectories for which you want the prediction. So if planes approach the Zurich airport, what you want is to have the wind speed for planes approaching the Zurich airport. So you have the measurement consistent with what you want to predict. And so the situation can be seen like that. You have the time and you have trajectories. For some stuff, you have the measurement of the wind, and for other part of the trajectories which are in the future, you don't have the wind. You already have the flight plan, so you know where will be the plane, but you would like to know the wind speed. And due to broadcasting of the info server, transfer of data and whatever, you have a 10-minute delay. But so bottom line, you have this, and you want to predict that. On the student, at first, so I'm going to explain the transformer, but at first he used kernel regression and adaptive kernel regression. So the first one was really kernel regression, so you just put a little Gaussian kernel at every measurement and you average, you do weighted average. And then we did something else, which was the kernels themselves, their shape was a function of the position, the geographic position through MLP. So perceptron, because we thought we could exploit some kind of how could I say this, specificities of the topology of the country that you would think, oh, it's over a lake, so the wind does this stuff, and it's mountain, the wind does other stuff. So, and then we moved to transformers, and what was funny that he worked for a year with those kernel, MLPs, whatever. And then I said, maybe we could try transformer. I said, yeah, good idea. I'm going to try. And 2 weeks later, he was beating the performance of the MLP. So we had something like that where you encode all those measurements. Each measurement is a token, and you have a positional encoding. So you encode in the measurement where it was taken. Then you have other ones for which you don't have the measurement, you just have the position, and you push all this through attention model, and you put a loss at the end saying, doing training, this is what I want to predict, and it works very well. So this was so smaller is better. This was after 1 year of work. This was 2 weeks after starting the transformers. And we have a paper under review at TMLR where we generalize this to other measurements. So this was working very well. Then I had another student who did some NERF stuff. So maybe I'm started a bit long, so I should accelerate a bit. But so NERF is an awesome computer vision stuff where you take several pictures of a scene and you have full calibration, so you know exactly where is the sensor in 3D, and you train a regressor, so a deep model that get as input location and direction of a ray of light, and it as output it tells you the color basically of this ray of light. And it's extremely powerful because it means it can really learn not only the 3D, but really the direction of the rays. So specularities and all this horrible stuff in computer vision, where when you have to deal with it, it's atrocious. It will do it. It will deal with mirrors. It will deal with. It's very, very powerful. And here what we did was simply an evaluation of the model. So this is how it works. You have the several views that you have, and you want to predict the new one. And basically, you take the average. You try to guess what is the color of the points over the direction of your new view, and you just guess what is the color to put there so that it's consistent with the other views. So it's easy to say. You simply, if the pixel is red seen from there and red seen from there, and you say it's red. The big issue is that you may have occlusion. So the pixel may be red, green. How do you know the green is not the correct one and is the other? So what we did was again to put transformers to the job. So here, for every pixel, we were encoding the position in 3D plus some properties of the scene, and we let the transformer with the attention to decide which view it should take into account for this pixel. And it was reasoning by looking at other things to decide if there was occlusion or not. And so here, if you have never seen NeRF, it's worth seeing it. So here you have the different views. This is what you learn from. On the views at the top are generated. So you only have the sparse view at the bottom. You train your model with the sparse view at the bottom. On the one on top are generated by moving virtually a sensor in the, so it works very well. Here we improve the state of the art, but the impressive stuff is NeRF itself. So yeah, I should not take credit for NeRF, but it's simply that again transformers really improve the performance. So I insist, the views at the bottom are the ones we have for during training, and the pictures at the top are generated, so they are super smooth because the model generalized and understood the scene completely. Okay, and then we also did imitation learning. So here you train with games of Minecraft, and you simply train an agent to. So you have we have this kind of videos where we have recorded people. We have access to people having they play Minecraft, and it's supervised with the actions. And so we try to learn what action to do in a certain context. Okay, how do I stop this thing? And then again we do a transformer. So we feed the frames in a transformer, and we have a readout for the action, and it works. But maybe what is but what is one, I think, again, impressive application are the world models. So again, it's for reinforcement learning. And here, what we want to do is to play Atari games. So it's a very standard benchmark for reinforcement learning. So you have those. There are something like 40 Atari games. So it's really real games that were designed in the 80s for people. So it's a nice benchmark because it has not been. It's still simple, and you have emulator for it, so you can run it. But it was not designed for AI. So it's real games for humans. Okay. So there was a famous paper in 2014, I think, where they just showed that. So if you're not familiar with reinforcement learning, basically you try to learn the value of action state. So the state is a complicated stuff. I have to how much I should go into detail, but so if you are in a Markovian, if the state is totally informative, you just look at the state on the action, and you try to predict. It's a bit complicated because you try to predict all the reward if you are doing this action now, and you do good stuff later. So if I want to go home tonight, I have to somewhere in my brain to know that moving a little bit my foot in that direction will bring me back to Yverdon. And then it's complicated because the model has to learn to propagate the reward from the end, the reward I get when I open my door of my house, up to now. And it's super sample inefficient. If you do it brutally, you have to train the network to approximate the stuff, but you also have to propagate the reward in this model from the moment you get the reward to any moment that participate to getting the reward. So it's really bad. So you need weeks of equivalent playing time for a model to play like you after 5 minutes. So it's really bad. So here what we do is something different. We train a world model. So it's a well-known strategy where we are not going to learn directly a policy where I give you the state and let's say a state and an action, and you give me the value. I'm going to train a model. I give you the state and the action, and you predict the next state. So it may look more complicated because predicting a reward or a value seems easy because you just predict one scalar, while if you need to predict the next state, it's complicated because in that case it will be an image. So now the problem I want to solve is I give you 5 seconds of game so that it's Markovian. I need to know a bit of the past. So the typical example, if a ball is moving If I have a single image, I see a ball, I have no idea where it's moving. If I have two images, now I know where it's moving. So you need a few images in the past. And we are going to train a model given 5 seconds of game, so 20 frames, something like that. On an action, what is the next frame? On the way we solve this, it's super brutal, and again, it worked really well. We train a discrete autoencoder. So discrete autoencoder will encode images. So we train separately. We don't talk about... yeah, by the way, we do this because then we are going to train the agent in this simulation. So we are going to create a world model, able, given the path and the action, to predict the next state. And when we have this, we basically built an emulator of the game. We understood the game, and now we train the agent playing on the emulator. On the way we build this world model is we train first a discrete autoencoder, which take an image and code it as 16 tokens, discrete, and we can decode back to the image, so we know all the information is there. But now that we have this, if you give me 5 seconds of game, I encode a frame as 16 tokens, action, 16 tokens for frame, action, and now I have a language, and I just train a GPT and tell it, okay, continue, generate the next tokens. And it works. If you decode the tokens, you get the image of the game. So to the point, so this is the model. So you have you start with an image, you encode it with your encoder, you get the tokens, and you decode it with your decoder, you would get the estimation of the image. Then the agent tell you what action it does. And now, because we have tokens, the GPT is going to predict 1 token for the reward, 1 token for is it the end of the episode, on the tokens, auto-regressively the tokens of the next image. And you maybe you don't find this impressive, but it's crazy. So the first time they showed me the result, I was like, no, you're wrong. This is not the network. This is the game. And they were, no, that's not the game. That's actually the network. It really learned everything. So it learned. You have monsters, they move around. When you go left, there is a scrolling. When you go to a tree, cut the tree, the score of the number of blank increases, the tree disappears, suddenly the night arrives. It completely understands stuff. So if you look at videos of the game, so you have this kind of result where you give it a starting image, and then you say, okay, now invent the game, and it tells you there are enemy coming, and sometimes it beats the crap out of the enemy dies, and they disappear, and it works. And if you look at the videos, it's really... So this is what the model generates. Does it work? Yes. This is not the video game. This is generated by the model. It just plays the game. It works the modes. I find this quite surprising. And it's very it's very accurate, because here what those are, I don't even know which side is what. That's really bad. But one side is the game, the other one is the simulation of the game with the same series of action. And I don't know which one. Looking at the videos to prepare this talk, I even made a mistake at some point. I thought that one video was the simulator, it was actually the game, and the other one around. But, and we do well. So we were state of the art on the 2 hours of gameplay. So here we train, that's the point. Instead of training with weeks of gameplay, we train the world model with 2 hours of playing, and then we train the agent never plays the game. The agent only plays in the dream of the simulator. Okay, and this was the last slide. Yeah, I believe in Transformers a lot.